Okay, we'll start. Okay, hello, final good afternoon for this extra lecture. This is the subject of the lecture. It won't take the whole period. I had thought I might give you the evaluations to fill out, but since there's not that many people here, I'm going to give them to you at the final. You'll have plenty of time to do the final and fill out the evaluation, so you'll get it then, and you therefore won't have one part of the end of term ritual that one often has in class. So the subject is 10 things I hope you learned, 4 things you might have learned, and a final word of wisdom. Right? Coffee today upstairs, for those of you on the Tuesday, Thursday cycle. I look forward to seeing some of you. And here, and now you're going to get the 10 things. So the first of these 10 things, you see it up here. There was a great expansion in the 18th century of claims for rights, which were based on some abstract principle of what it meant to be human, and that these claims were directed against states initially. That is to say, states would refrain from doing things or were enjoined to do things. And this enjoining, this direction of human rights discourse to states was because it was feared that the states otherwise would infringe on these rights or would not grant these rights. And I just want to remind you of the early parts of the course, how we talked about this in a variety of contexts. We talked about it in the context of constitutions, in constitutionalism, which produces, which are claim by a citizenry based on some higher principle against the actions of a state. We talked about a longer history of this as unwritten constitutions, and then the age of written constitutions that began in the 18th century and which is now almost universal. And almost all constitutions, and remember we talked about constitutions from the American Constitution to the South African Constitution, embody some version of human rights claims, of these general universal claims. So I just remind you, the Declaration of Independence is one such claim, the American Constitution is another such claim, but these are just examples of a much broader global history that I've been talking to you about. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is one of the most famous because, of course, the French Revolution and its influence spread all over Europe and ultimately all over the world as a set of claims, the exact content of which I will talk to you about in a moment. But notice this sort of this imagery which we talked about at the time. It's written like the tablets of Moses. I mean, these are deep principles, not just the casual principles of the moment. And they were understood at the time and have subsequently understood to be, in some sense, these deep principles. That's what I've been trying to tell you about before. They were embodied in a constitution in 91, which is based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, and they would be an expanded version embodied in another constitution I want to come to you about in a moment, and they were taken to be something applicable all over the world. And you remember I showed you this picture of an Arabic translation of this done by the French in the context of actually imperial enterprise, claiming we're going to bring human rights to the rest of the other parts of the world. And as you have learned, this idea of spreading human rights, even in colonial contexts, is in some sense rejected by some and embraced by others. But the beginning of this history of spreading this idea of a universal claim of some sort of rights, individual and political or economic and social, which we come to, begins, I wanted to argue, in the 18th century, though it too had roots. So that was the beginning 3 lectures of the course. The other trajectory that we were on from the beginning of the course is what I talked about in humanitarianism and humanitarian narrative. At roughly the same time, the needs of strangers became more exigent through the development of humanitarian narrative and humanitarian claims. And I tried to suggest that the anti-slavery campaign was the first example of this. So whatever you think about the hypocrisy or the contradictions or self-contradiction of humanitarianism, it's still very important for you to realize that there was a time, not so terribly long ago, when we had no interest, basically, in what happened in distant parts of the world. So either that someone in England or in France or somewhere would actually care about what happened in Africa or knew about what happened in Africa is an innovation, and was understood to be an innovation at the time. And we talked about techniques in which made this possible. So we just remind you that during that part of the course, I showed you pictures of how these kinds of suffering, how this kind of suffering was made public and was made manifest and was understood. So much of what we talked about in the course is in a sense, how did people come to understand that the rights of someone at a distance had been violated, that something inhumane had been done to them, and that they had some responsibility to do something about it, and they could in fact do something about it. So when you guys raised your hand when the person from Amnesty International was there and said, how many of you had done some of these things? Many of you had. I just want you to think about that it's rather remarkable that you would know about these happenings and that you would do something about it. It's just historically remarkable and novel. And so I'm just remind you of some of the pictures we saw, and this genre of pictures is not unlike, in a way, what we saw when we saw the movie of the clearing of houses in Nigeria. It was this making this distant thing present to you. So we had it in painting, we had it in photography, and now, of course, we have it, of course, in film. This is the Turner painting as a part of the 19th century anti-slavery campaign, referring back to the 18th century scandal of the Zong, in which a sea captain, as you might recall, threw slaves into the sea and then collected their insurance. So the remarkable thing is not that slavery continued, but that for the first time, actually, in thousands of years, which has had slavery, people thought this is a bad idea, rather than saying, okay, these slaves are dispensable, who cares? So that's what I was trying to suggest to you is culturally and politically innovative. And again, we talked about the first versions of how this enters into popular and consumer culture. So I talked to you about these tchotchkes, bowls and stuff, sugar bowls, teacups, vases, all of which connect the person who purchases them with this broader human rights culture. It was also the first boycott of the sort that many of you have engaged in, the Nike boycott. You probably not engaged in the diamond boycott, but it exists. Right? So again, what you buy as a consumer has some political effect, and the organization of that is buying for political purposes, for international human rights purposes, begins in this period. It begins in the period of the mass production of. So this is sugar not made by slaves. Is not so different from what the slogan of the human rights URAP students last year, who were selling chocolate on Valentine's Day, saying chocolate not made by slaves. But we did have sell chocolate not made by slaves, which meant incentive not made by indentured child labor. So this story that you see around campus, you will see again on campus on Valentine's Day, begins now, begins in this period. And it did have actually some import. It's not the only thing that did it. We didn't actually go into the detailed history of why the slave trade declined, but it did. And it is, to me at least, clear that in a very significant way it declined because of an organized campaign against it. Okay. So that's the humanitarian narrative, the claim of universal human rights, and its entering into popular culture of certain sorts. And now another point, I want to raise a point that was raised again in the next to last lecture, but we've raised periodically, is that from the very beginning, there's a debate and a tension between individual and political rights, what some of our guests 3 days ago called bourgeois or liberal rights on the one hand, and social, economic, and cultural rights, I suppose non-bourgeois, socialist, not a language, proletarian, not a language I like, but that was the language we use. So one is liberal and one is an individualistic and one is not. So I try to suggest to you that those two things have been there from the very beginning. It's not just a Cold War issue or a post-Cold War issue or an imperialist or non-imperialist issue. It was there from the birth of this discussion. And so, just to remind you, to show you this picture again, this is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and it's individualistic. It says that you, as an individual, have the right to free speech, have the right to property, have the right to be free from torture, have the right of religious worship, have the right to habeas corpus. I mean, have habeas corpus. You can't be imprisoned illegally. All these sort of personal and political rights, which were enshrined in our Declaration in our Bill of Rights, and in almost every liberal constitution since. So the great struggle of the 19th century, though you not take this for granted, the great struggle of the 19th century was in fact for these liberal freedoms, because most countries, or at least many countries, in fact had censorship. And many countries still have censorship. So the first stage of an effective campaign for social and economic and cultural rights was taken to be political and civil rights. So why should every person have a vote or reasonably fair taxation, integrity of a person? Was because without it, you couldn't campaign for all the other things you wanted to do. If you were sent to Siberia arbitrarily, which happened to thousands of people in the 19th century in Russia, to give an example, this other issue was irrelevant. So there was this individual personal liberal, and this is the liberal program of the 19th and early 20th century, which is sometimes was taken to be in opposition to the economic and social and cultural, and it's sometimes taken to be a step toward it. So this declaration is expanded in the year 1793, and more to the point, enters into the Constitution of the year 1793, the beginning of the radical phase of the French of the Revolution. It was a constitution which never came into force because war intervened, and then this left regime fell in 1795. But the claim that public relief is a sacred debt, society owes maintenance to unfortunate citizens. Society noticed. It's not individual. Society owes something to everyone, not politically, but economically. Education is needed by all. Society ought to favor all its power the advancement of the public reason and to put education at the door of every citizen. This is a struggle that we're still engaged with today. I just came from a forum which dealt with the question of whether education is a public right, or a public good, or a private right and a private good. And citizens in this country, and whether the state does or doesn't owe people jobs. And I just give you a statistic which I thought was rather remarkable that I just learned 10 minutes ago. You won't be surprised to learn that this how one views this depends on one socioeconomic group. So 27% of the poorest quintile, the poorest economic group, only 27% of these people oppose the idea that the state is in some sense responsible for providing work, reasonable sustenance for its citizens. 62% of the highest social economic group oppose this idea. So the people like in the French Revolution, the people in need feel the state owes them something. The people not in need are more interested and not so interested in these claims. And what this forum was about was the fact that it's the people who were not in need who are in fact the ones who were most politically active by every gauge that these people were talking about. So this is still something that's very much before us as we speak. And when we're done with this class, you might go over to Wheeler and catch the tail end of a really interesting discussion on the subject in the Dean's Forum. Okay, so these social and economic rights have always been on the table. I acknowledged, I agree that in some sense after the fall of communism, one could speak about these issues in a different way than in the period of the Cold War, where individual liberty represents the West, and this isn't entirely true, but crudely speaking, the one was the liberal versus the social. And that's not so true anymore. So it changed a little bit, but on the hand